Ta-da! Winning!
We did it. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
All right, guys. Well, welcome to Trigger Talk for all of you who are on. Thank you so much for taking the time. My name is Rupa Mohan. I'm the founder of the Sweat Social. We're a corporate wellness company, and we focus on providing mind and body wellness solutions for people based on their specific jobs and the demands those jobs places on their minds and their bodies. I brought together today some new friends and some old friends. Really excited to jump into this. When all the coronavirus lockdowns around the world started, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling a lot of different feelings, was really in my feelings, and I thought this would be a good space to talk about it. And not just coronavirus and the lockdown, but everything that's going on. So we're going to kick this off in a little bit of an unorthodox way. I'm going to have each panelist go around, introduce themselves, say what they do. But we also thought it would be good to just get our feelings out on the tables, because we're all experiencing different levels of triggers and the feelings that come with those. And we'll talk a little bit more about what an actual trigger is and how we can manage through some of those. But for me personally, I live near an airport, so I can see planes coming and going, and I didn't see them for a long time, and now I'm seeing them, and it's giving me this sense of feeling really, really trapped and having nothing to look forward to. I live very far away from my family and my friends, and so that's been weighing on me, a stress and anxiety. And when that happens, I tend to emotionally eat my feelings. So like the chocolate and the chips and all the things, and on a normal day, I'm not doing that. I know I'm not the only one, but that's just me personally. So let's kick it over. Krista, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, do we have an hour to talk about all my feelings? Honestly, I think the big thing I've noticed, and like there's definitely like specific things that we can all point to that are grabbing our attention, but I think part of it is like this death by 1,000 paper cuts. And what I'm feeling is like my brain is like a sunburn that someone is like rubbing on. And so it feels like my ability to manage even the small day-to-day, like going to the grocery store kinds of challenges, has been so diminished. And I'm noticing just like my ability to regulate myself around very basic things like task switching, right? Things grabbing my attention. Look over here, look over here, look over here. I'm noticing that like really, really diminishing. So like a lot of people on this call, I think I'm feeling really raw, dysregulated. Like the smallest things are just like, oh, I can't deal. And this is a very new feeling for me personally, because I've always been like the sensible one. and so I think it has to do with like the collective level of stuff that's coming up for us as a culture, as a society, as individuals, whether that's stuck in our apartment, whatever it is. So I think that's kind of the name I'd put to it, is just that collective volume of things that are just eroding us day to day. Oh, I think you're muted, Rupa. There you go.
Krista, quickly tell us what you do as well.
Oh, I forgot. I was jumping right into the bad stuff. Yes, I'm the director of curriculum at Precision Nutrition. So I write, so we coach clients at Precision Nutrition, and then we also write curriculum to train nutrition coaches. And so mainly my job these days is to write that certification material for nutrition coaches. So I help coaches be better coaches. Basically, that's my day job.
Awesome. All right, Carlos, over to you.
Hey guys, Carlos Davila here, adjunct psychology professor at John Jay, and I also have been teaching sports psychology for the last 5 or so years at LIU, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. Also, I've been a fitness instructor and personal trainer for about 15 or so years, and also a dad. And I kind of wanted to make sure I went over those 3 parts, because for me, my triggers are like, as a trainer, going back into the world, what's that gonna look like, right? What impact is the pandemic and COVID, and how we're adjusting to just being around people when I work in a space where you're around people all the time. So there's that level of anxiety. As the professor, starting to get anxious about these kids that are going to kind of get lost in the shuffle as we're shifting to this distance learning. So that's been a little bit triggering. And then as the dad of two Black children, there's a whole nother layer of, you know, anxiety and triggers and, to be honest, sleepless nights and really uncomfortable, awkward thoughts. And I had a moment where I went into the city for the first time, I want to say last week, and I'm in the car and I'm miserable. Like, just like it's a very palpable kind of misery that I'm feeling. And my lady's like, are you okay? Like, what is wrong with you? It's like, I can't put it into words, but I'm like overwhelmed with anxiety right now. And I didn't know what the city was going to look like. This was like after all the protests and like things had been looted. And I was like literally in a ball of anxiety going into the city because I didn't know. And I'm always in the city, like literally from 5 p.m. in the morning to 9 p.m. I'm in the city. So having this moment where I'm actually anxious to go into the city was something that was definitely an interesting experience. And I started thinking about, well, how many other people are being triggered by just getting on? I don't know when I'm going to get back on the train. Like, that's not a space that I'm comfortable with right now. But like, all these things have now become, like, outside is a trigger now.
Yeah.
Right? People are a trigger now. Like, it's mind blowing when you really sit and think about like where we're at as far as the things that we're like, wait, people? More than 4 people in a space? No, I'm not here for that. So a little long-winded, but that's my current experience.
All right, over to Jen.
Okay, hi, my name is Jennifer Rogers. I am lead instructor and wellness coordinator for the Sweat Social. I've known Rupa for a while, since like 2017. I'm also a therapeutically oriented yoga teacher here in New Orleans, Louisiana. I also teach group fitness as well. So I think I've come to this space already dealing with anxiety in my life from the get-go. So at the current situation, I kind of feel like my anxiety level is like operating at a higher level than it has been in a long time. And it's definitely something I'm feeling personally, but also something that I feel collectively. Because especially in New Orleans, like New Orleans, we're such a community-driven people, Louisiana in general, we're all about festivals and being around each other and people. And now we're so isolated and everyone is feeling everything. And so like, as a person who's trained to be sensitive to that kind of stuff, it's not only my own stuff, but I'm also kind of like picking it up off of people that you pass. And then as what Carlos said, like you're passing people and it used to be a thing, like where you're like greeting people. And that's such a like a huge part of the culture in Louisiana. It's like, hello, how are you? You talk to people. And now it's like, you know, you stay away from them and you're just kind of more frightened around them, which is kind of a weird feeling. But yeah, that and the compounding of like all the things besides the COVID and then like the political unrest and the protests here in the city, and then not to mention the hurricanes that have started to like, you know, the season is upon us. It's just like, what else? You know, there's this big kind of thing of like the unknown of what's going to happen. You know, the bigger picture feels a little bit scarier than it used to.
I will say it's so nice to see smiles because we're always behind a mask. So I'm so loving
Right,
that.
totally. And you're just smiling at that person being like, and they can't see you, and you just kind of realize like, oh, that's fine.
Patty, I'm glad you made it. We're just going around doing introductions. So tell us what you do and what your triggers are right now, and then we're going to jump right in.
Well, me trying to get onto the Zoom was a trigger. Just FYI. I don't know why it wasn't working. Anyway, hello everybody. Nice to meet you. My name is Patty Sioka. I'm based in Los Angeles, California. I am a life coach. Got my cert through Journey, which is an ICF accredited program. ICF is the International Coach Federation, which kind of oversees life coaches because they're not really regulated yet, but it's a great program. My current triggers have been being stuck in a 2-bedroom apartment. And in LA, it's tough because you can't just like walk outside and go to the grocery store. So being stuck in a 2-bedroom apartment with my partner and my special needs daughter has definitely been a trigger for me. And like Jen, I also come with a lot of anxiety from my past. So just lots of different stuff, you know, triggering me, just like not being able to go to the gym, not having my freedoms, just random stuff, you know. having to talk to people over Zoom. So that's kind of my thing. And then, and then now another trigger is like actually transitioning back into work.
Yeah.
That is super stressful.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to deal with the volume while still like doing distance learning with my daughter. That's been super, super tough. So trying to navigate all those feelings. And that's kind of where I'm at.
All
Let's
right.
dive in.
Yeah, we're going to dive into the attendees. If you hit the Q&A option on the bottom here, we will be doing taking your questions after we address a couple of things. So please fire those away. All the panelists can see them. And let's just jump into this. So question one is actually for all of the panelists. In your line of work, let's just talk about how you actually define a trigger, because my husband and I actually got into it right before the Zoom call, which is also why I'm still sweating, about like, wait, but is it the cause or the effect, and what actually is the trigger? But the trigger causes it, and then there's a feeling associated with it, and there's a reaction. So there's all these different, and Carlos, you had talked about this too, there's all these different layers to what's going on here. So given all of your lines of work and what you do, I'd like to hear how you define a trigger. So Jen, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so from the therapeutics world, most of the time I'm dealing with the body response to a trigger. And I would define a trigger is just any kind of either outside stimulus or a stimulus from the body, whether it be sensation or whatever, that takes the person back to that place of trauma, whatever they experienced. There's kind of just like a rut or a freeze space in the brain where they just kind of get transported back flashback wise. From there, you can have a myriad of different reactions. It just kind of depends on the person's makeup and where they are, et cetera. There's just so many controls. But yeah, from the therapeutics world, it's mostly disassociation, tightening up, like actual physical manifestation in the body, shortness of breath, digestive issues, all of those things. You're muted.
Krista, what about you?
For me, a trigger, I don't actually assume that it's negative or positive. For me, a trigger is just something that initiates typically an automatic sequence of behaviors. Like, so I come from behavior change, right? So for me, a trigger is anything that sort of stimulates or kicks into motion a series of like previously programmed behaviors or emotions or thoughts. And the analogy that I've seen used is like those old carnival machines where you like put a penny in or whatever, back in the days we had pennies, you know, and it would do a thing, right? Or like a Plinko, you know, where it's like the ball goes down and there's some kind of sequence. And so the trigger would be the coin, right? Clink, and then something happens. So it can be really simple, you know, like I have a water glass on my bathroom sink, and every time I go to the bathroom, I drink a glass of water. That's my trigger to drink a glass of water. So the trigger is cup, see the cup, do the thing, right? So for me, doing the thing or feeling the feelings or having the thoughts or whatever emerges out of that is not necessarily positive or negative, but for me, it's really more that they are either pre-programmed or a sequence that you're wanting to do, right? Because you can have, if you're changing your behavior, you can have a trigger that reminds you to do the new behavior until it becomes ingrained. So it doesn't have to necessarily be so automatic that it's subconscious. Although I do think now in this talk, we're kind of talking about stuff that's like coming up that we didn't necessarily realize was so ingrained and automatic in us. So that's how I think about it. And just the final thing for me is, coming from a science background, I also think of it almost like a catalyst in a chemical reaction, right? Some kind of substance that either initiates or hastens a chemical reaction or like, you know, sequence of events. So that's how it is for me.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to start that next question with you, Krista, because I like what you said, that it initiates a sequence of behaviors. But Carlos, let's go over to you.
So I have always, just because of my psych background, you know, as an instructor, as a personal trainer, have kind of used a biopsychosocial model when looking at like triggers that may be impacting my clients, right? Because when a client comes into my space, I have no idea what their previous experiences have been, right? And what I may be doing that's triggering this negative response for this like terrible trainer that they used to have, or this class that they went to that they had this really bad reaction to. So for me, whenever I'm sensing any sort of reaction or response that doesn't fit the situation, right? If I'm noticing that my client is now being a lot more quiet after I said something, or someone comes into the studio and you see that person kind of tense up, right? All these little things that we don't often pay attention to, but physiologically we're having a reaction. A lot of times we don't even know what that reaction is. So I spend a lot of time helping my clients, especially with the one-on-one, because anybody out there that's a trainer, you're also a therapist, whether you want to or not. You're also a part-time therapist. As a trainer, I try to help people sort of understand when those moments are happening. And then as much as possible within that framework, kind of take a step back. Okay, where's this coming from? Why are you feeling this way? And kind of break it apart a little bit. Because a lot of times that's the biggest hurdle, like understanding, well, why am I reacting this way? Because we're used to that reaction, right? Like Chris has said, like it's this, you don't think about it. You're tense, but you don't know why, right? And if we're in the middle of a training session and you're tense all of a sudden, and I'm trying to get you to do a movement, but your shoulders are up here because you're triggered, like we have to work through that. We have to process that. And like Jen made a great point, like what else? Like that's the slogan for 2020. What else, right? How many things have we been triggered since January, right? Let's think about it, guys. Kobe died, right? Which impacted a lot of us. Australia was burning. We have coronavirus. We have quarantine. We have all the images of Ahmaud, Breonna, and George Floyd within a few days, right? Black Lives Matter picks up. Cities are now slowly starting to open up when they shouldn't, and we're now getting upset about it, right? Trump being Trump, the protests and the images of increased police brutality, increased images of blatant racism, all cards being on the table now with different organizations having to like take a stand on Black Lives Matter. Like that's a lot of stuff that's happening at the same time. And all these things are creating different triggers that a lot of us didn't know that we had, right? If you're someone who at your job dealt with a ton of microaggressions, right? And you didn't realize that you were dealing with those microaggressions, but now that all these things are starting to, all these behaviors that can be considered either microaggressions, which are those subtle kind of, at times, unintentional forms of racism. And now we have like super, super aggressive racism to deal with as well. All these things are bringing back images of your own experiences, stories that you've been told from your parents, you know, all these really like generational forms of trauma that a lot of us haven't had the time, the space, or the capacity to really unpack. All of that stuff is coming in now, and we're closed in, you know, for 2 months in a situation that may not be ideal. Like, so for me, I think one of the biggest things that I'm trying to make sure that I'm on top of when I do engage with the world again, and even with my online clients, is there are going to be a lot of things that are happening right now that are going to create tension. We are trying to use this hour, this 45 minutes of time to decrease that tension. And if that means you're spending half an hour of that time talking about what's triggering you right now in the middle of your sit-ups, in the middle of your burpees, then we're kind of killing two birds with one stone, and also using that exercise as a coping mechanism.
Exactly. And we'll get into that in a minute in terms of how to cope. But Patty, over to you. And I think something that Carlos touched on is something that we've talked about a lot too, is like these past traumas. And Carlos, you mentioned these generational traumas. So Patty, how do you sort of define a trigger given your line of work as a life coach?
I define it very similar to what Carlos and Jen had said, which is I usually look for an emotional hot button. So when I see a really strong reaction to something that doesn't really warrant that type of reaction, that's kind of what I'm looking for. So for me, a strong emotional reaction would be like rage or extreme panic, extreme anxiety, despair. And because I think we've all experienced triggers, it's a lot easier for us from the outside to identify for our clients, right? So Carlos, it's a lot easier for him when he's training someone to say, hey, that reaction isn't warranted, right? So I think that's kind of the thing I look for. If I'm talking to someone in person, then I'm looking for a physical reaction too. Because a lot of times triggers aren't just, like someone getting angry at something isn't necessarily a trigger it's an emotional response, but it's not necessarily a trigger. A trigger is usually something with an emotional response and a physical reaction that takes a little bit of time to calm down from. So those are the sorts of things that I use to identify triggers. And especially right now, like everybody's just triggering like crazy. Carlos, your line of work, I mean, like, and Jen too. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as we, do start to kind of get back into the studios.
Pray for me.
Yeah, I will.
So before we move on to the next question I thought it would be a good time. We had a question come in from the audience in terms of how do we identify subconscious triggers? And I think, Carlos, why don't you take this one first? Because I think it's going back to, maybe those microaggressions or things we don't even know that are happening. Could those be subconscious triggers as well?
I mean, that's the inherent difficulty of really diving into and figuring out triggers, because unless it's something that's like very blatant that you're aware of, you may not even be aware of what's triggering you. So that's where that difficulty comes in with the subconscious part of it. But I think similar to something that Krista said, if you're focusing on the reaction, right? Like most of us know how we inherently react to certain situations, right? You know what annoys you, what you enjoy, and everything in between. When you're starting to have reactions that don't feel normal, right? That feel exaggerated. Like we've all had moments where we react to something, we're like, why was that? We've had that internal conversation. Why was I so upset? Why did that bother me as much? Those are the moments that I try to get people to lean into. Like when you have that moment, stop, write it down, take a note, put it in your phone. You have no excuse for not having something to write on. Everybody has a phone, right? And go back to that, right? And think about the context that created that reaction. What were you thinking? Who were you with? What were you listening to? What were you smelling? Like literally, you want to go through all 5 senses, because the triggers, how did someone touch you that may have been a trigger, right? It's something that I, as a fitness instructor, I have to be very mindful of, because I can tap someone on the shoulder, I can tap someone on their lower back to help them get their form right. And that could be something that completely takes that person to a negative space because it's associated with something internally, right? So for me, it's what the external reaction to that trigger is that'll help kind of backtrack and go and figure out, okay, well, we understand what the response was. We understand the context that response was created. Let's kind of peel that onion a little bit and figure out exactly where this is coming from.
And Jen, in your line of work in dealing with a lot of trauma that resides in the body, how do you see this sort of play out in sort of identifying any subconscious things that we're holding?
Well, I mean, of course, if it's subconscious, you're going to feel the reaction first, and it can be quite confusing. And then it can also be misidentified a lot of times, I think, like just you associate it with something else. And but the first thing that came to mind, which goes along with what Carlos said, is just journaling, is encouraging journaling and encouraging a sense of presence and stopping in that exact moment. Mm-hmm. Because that's when like the real kind of, so you can turn on all the senses, you can start to like actually come inside and turn internally and just feel what you're feeling, figure out, like write it down, take a moment, breathe, etc. So you can maybe pinpoint it. And then after a while, the pattern starts to happen. And then that's maybe when you can start to identify it. And then honestly, and if you want to seek outside resources, like whether it be working in the therapeutics world or seeking talk therapy or stuff like that, those can be helpful tools to bring to a professional who can be like, oh, like, let's look at this, let's look at all these, patterns and help you figure it out.
Yeah. No, that's great. So Krista, I'm going to circle back to what you were saying in terms of initiating that sequence of behaviors, and it doesn't necessarily have to be negative or positive. And the next thing I wanted to jump into is how do we sort of think about reconfiguring these? We all assume it's a trigger. So how do we start to reconfigure it? Like for myself, I make a joke of it, but maybe every time I walk past the kitchen, instead of eating, I do 5 squats or I do 5 push-ups, like you drink the glass of water when you go into the bathroom. But are there ways that we can start to rewire our brain to say, this doesn't have to be something negative, make it a positive?
Yeah, there definitely are. And I think just building on what other people have said, it's part of it starts with recognition that almost anything you are doing can be an automatic sequence of behaviors. And I think like some of what we're describing is very sympathetic nervous system stuff, right? Getting amped up, getting anxious, getting angry, right? But a lot of what happens to us can also be parasympathetic nervous stuff. So that is like checking out, zoning out, going like glazing over, sleeping, like anything that just like powers down the machine, right? So I think like there are going to be times you're never going to know what causes something. That like we can excavate the why, and sometimes we find it and sometimes we don't, but it doesn't mean that we can't start to look for adaptive behaviors. And so one of the easiest ways I find is, so one of the things you could do is you could invent a new sequence for yourself, right? You could do that mental work and be like, I'm going to, you know, instead of this, I'm going to do this. Cool. I mean, that's a great pathway, right? So inventing alternatives is one, especially if those alternatives compete, right? So for example, for a lot of people, mid-afternoon is snacky time, right? Because you're bored and you're stressed and it's like, you know, your energy's dipping. You can do an activity that competes with that. So yeah, it can be, you know, going to your fridge. It can be getting outside. It can be walking the dog. It can be doing anything that just inhibits you from doing the other activities. So one of the easiest ways is, rather than coming up with like a specific sequence, find something that in itself prevents you from doing the other thing. And our goal is really to make this as easy as possible. Because I think one of the things I see a lot in clients, and Carlos probably with clients sees something similar, is they think that the solution needs to be quite complicated and very effortful, right? So they're like, okay, I'm going to construct this whole like solution for myself. But that like just adds to the cognitive load, right? It just adds to the emotional load. So like rule number one in the game is make it as easy and lazy and simple as it possibly can be. So if it's as simple as like take the dog for a walk and the dog will tell you when it's time for a walk, great. Like that's a win. But the other thing is to look for areas where the problem doesn't happen or happens less, even if it's just a little bit, and to use that as your point of entry into seeking other alternatives. Because I think people are like, well, I have to, you know, something is broken and I have to fix it. But nobody is broken 100% of the time, right? As screwed up as anyone listening, like if you're listening and you're like, no, you don't understand, I'm totally screwed up. As screwed up as anyone is, no one is screwed up 100% of the time, right? Like that, there's a 1% or 10% or 50% time when you're not screwed up. So look for clues in those moments where you have those little windows of feeling good, relaxed, happy, fun. Oh, you know what? I colored with my 5-year-old for 3 minutes and that was really groovy. I enjoyed that, right? So look for those little tiny windows when things don't suck. And then ask yourself, could I make those windows bigger? Is that something that's available to me? So there's lots and lots of strategies for this. I've just kind of given a real quick overview, but that's where I would start.
No, I love that. Like, when is it not happening and have you repeat that behavior?
Yeah.
Going in on that. Patty, what about you? Like, what have you, you know, in talking with your clients and working with folks, like how do you sort of turn that positive into a negative or give them strategies to do that? Oh, you're muted. Oh no, I think you're muted, Patty.
Working?
Yeah.
Okay. For the people that I've been working with, I feel like practicing mindfulness has probably been the best tool or the most useful, because sometimes they find themselves in these situations where they can't necessarily leave the situation, right? Like if they're, I work with a lot of creatives and they tend to be in very, very stressful situations. So if they can grasp the concept that their thoughts are not, they're just thoughts, right? It's not who they are. It's their mind spinning, right? And so getting a handle on that. So sometimes like they'll call me when they're in the middle of these situations and I'll walk them through a small exercise. And what we do is, the first thing that we do is we recognize that they're having an emotional reaction or an emotional response to whatever it was that set them off, right? Like a director yelled at them, or, you know, some producer took something away from them would be an example, and like a tool that they really, really needed. And so we'll identify like, okay, what was it that set them off? Then the next thing that we'll do is we'll acknowledge like that they're having, we'll acknowledge their emotions, like they're feeling angry, they're feeling anxious, they're panicking, they don't know what to do. And then the next thing that we'll do is we'll like look at their physical response, right? And then we'll kind of like talk about that. And then the last thing we'll do is we will talk about how this is just a reaction. It doesn't identify who they are. And once they identify that they're really just having a response to a situation, that alone usually just calms them down and really helps them kind of reframe their headspace, right? It's like literally just taking their mindset and realizing like, okay, something set me off. That's not really what's happening. I need to take a moment, go grab a snack, go to the bathroom, whatever, take 5 minutes and kind of recenter. And usually that does the trick. Now, it's like a thing where they kind of need a little bit more time to calm down, then, you know, we kind of take a little bit more time to talk through things. But it's really just about getting them to grasp the idea that it's just their mind spinning. And that they need to be a little bit more mindful and like understand it's just a reaction.
So this is sort of directed, this next question, more to Patty and Carlos. And Carlos, let's start with you. Even around, just talk to us about the psychology of how you identify a trigger. So we talked about the subconscious triggers that we can identify, but even just something as simple as, I heard the song and I reacted. How do you start to peel back the layers to understand why is that doing it for me? And that's a very simple example. And I know it can be a lot more complicated for people if they've experienced past trauma or things have happened to them in their life. But what are some tools people can use to start to identify what those are?
Absolutely. And I wanted to actually touch on something that Krista said about like finding those windows where things don't suck. I think something that as much as we're like, quarantine has been terrible and like this reframing of how we function has been terrible, this has also been a space for us to like hone in on the things that were creating these negative spaces, right? We're home a lot more. Like, you know, I remember at the beginning of quarantine, the joke was, well, now we're going to see which meetings could have been emails, right? And we're starting to realize that like, maybe I can work from home and not deal with these stressors and these triggers that are out there that are negatively impacting my day-to-day experience, right? Like me not having to wake up at 4:30 in the morning. Why would I ever want to do that again, right? Because you start to associate if you know, again, there are a lot of variables that are coming into play with quarantine and how people are kind of living through that experience, but it's also a space where you can start to reframe some of the things that have impacted you negatively before. So I'm a big fan of alliteration. So when I think about dealing with triggers, I think about recognizing, reframing, and then reinforcing, right? So recognizing, we already talked about, like what is causing this reaction, right? And once we figure that out, how do we reframe that? How do we change the way you perceive that? And this is if it's negative. There's definitely like positive triggers. And as we were talking about it, a bunch of different positive triggers popped into my head. Like if I walk by a bakery store, I'm immediately reminded of my grandmother from my childhood, because that used to be my little chore to go down to the store, get some baked bread and bring it back, right? So that's a positive kind of trigger for me. So reframing that and then reinforcing it, right? Because the same way we learn to associate this response with that memory or that physiological reaction, we have to learn how to reframe it. And that has to be reinforced, right? And that can be, you can use like operant conditioning and positive reinforcement if you want, but whatever's going to resonate with that person as far as reinforcing this new, more adaptive variation of that, right? To give you an example, when quarantine started, and again, we were all super depressed, I started at some point to realize that I was drinking wine to help me calm down way too early in the day. Like 12:01, I was like,
do it.
It's happy hour somewhere. And I had a moment where I was like, clearly like this emotional space that we're in, this uncertainty, this fear. Because again, remember when quarantine started, we were all terrified. We had no idea what this was. We thought headless bats were going to be coming out of everywhere and zombies, and who knew, right? So I told myself, you can't work out until 3-4 o'clock, because I knew that I wasn't going to drink anything before I worked out. So at the very least, I was waiting till 5 to have my first glass of wine because I didn't want it to go before my workout. So for me, it was again like recognizing what it is. I'm in quarantine. I have no idea what's going to happen next. And now I'm drinking more than I normally do. How do I reframe that? Okay, I still want to have my glass of wine, but maybe just keep it at a glass. So let me start a little bit later in the day. How do I reinforce that? I change my fitness routine so that I'm working out later so that it forces me to have to wait. So it's, and again, the difficulty with this is that recognizing the first step is the hardest step. Because once you figure out the first step, then you can kind of play around with how do I create a positive reinforcer for this, or how do I reframe this so that I'm not responding as negatively as I do. And again, there are certain things that you're any trauma, any childhood trauma, you're gonna inherently have a negative reaction, but being able to figure out ways to cope with that reaction, figuring out ways to, you're not gonna negate necessarily that emotional response, but reframing it so that whatever that response is more positive, whether it's when I'm feeling this way, I'm gonna work out, or I'm gonna read a book, or I'm gonna listen to this song that I know is gonna like soothe me when I'm in that, you know, heightened negative emotional state. Figuring out for you specifically, like what are gonna be those things that allow me to reframe and kind of sit more constructively in what this response is gonna be.
Yeah, Patty, is there anything that you would add to that in terms of really getting to the root of what's causing?
Yeah, I mean, for me, as someone that has experienced a lot of triggers, because I had a kind of a more gnarly upbringing, I didn't realize I was triggering, right? And so I just knew I was like a highly reactive person for a long time. I didn't know what that was or what it meant. And so finally I went to therapy and I was like, oh, got it. That comes from, I just thought I was, you know, I'm half Latin, so I just thought that was my Latin side flaring up. But a tool that I found was super useful was asking myself why. And an example for me was I had an ex-husband that was really, really bad with money, and he would always check the mail, and he took care of paying the bills on his doorstep. And I had gone to check the mail, and I happened to just like open up the bills, and I'd opened up one of the credit card bills and saw that he had charged $30,000 on a credit card. And so what ended up happening was going to check the mail became a trigger for me. Yeah. And so I couldn't check the mail for a long time. And so after, you know, my divorce and all that sort of stuff, I would never check the mail. My friends or my roommates were like, why don't you check the mail? I'm like, I just don't like checking the mail. And so then it became this thing where it's like, hey, you need to check the mail. It's like, well, I don't want to check the mail. They said, why don't you want to check the mail? And I said, because it gives me anxiety. And so they said, well, why does it give you anxiety? I said, because I'm scared I'm going to find something bad. Well, why do you think you're going to find something bad? I said, because when I was married, my ex-husband charged an obscene amount of money on a credit card, and I found out I was like crazy amount of money in debt. That actually ended up, I looked up after the fact, and it's actually an exercise called the 5 whys. Mm-hmm. And so what it is you identify the problem and you continue to ask yourself why. And so, you know, that would be an example. And sometimes it takes 3 whys, sometimes it takes 10 whys, but it's a really great way of getting to the root of the problem. And so it's also super helpful, like when someone's triggering, to say, I overreact to this situation. Why do I overreact to that situation? And that's a very like simple, easy exercise to kind of just like really peel back a bunch of those layers of that onion to figure out what's the problem. Because once you figure out what that trauma is, or what is causing you to react, or, you know, whatever that memory is or that situation, then you can kind of like take it, examine it, start to look at it, and then you can start to heal from it, and sometimes even tolerate that trigger. It doesn't become a trigger anymore, you know? So now I can check the mail.
And it's so fun now because of all the Amazon packages you get.
Exactly. I love it. I'm actually waiting for shoes.
Okay, so this next question is more for Krista and for Jen. And I mean, we've touched on it a little bit, but let's try to dig in a little deeper. I think a lot of times we focus on the physical aspect of what's happening. So Carlos saying I have to push my workout, or me saying I need to stop eating so much. And it manifests a lot of times like nutritionally and physically. And so what are actions that we can take to sort of, and I think one of you had said this at some point, to sort of honor it and then put it into in a positive way to us. If there's anything that you can dig into a little bit deeper. So Krista, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for Jen, but I'm going to assume that she's on board with this thought, which is that I think we often devalue or separate our bodies from ourselves, right? So like my body is doing this thing, like this, like there's this floating head above this like container that we move around with, right? But I think one of the things that's super important for helping you understand all of that we're talking about is there's no distinction between you and your body. You are your body. You think with your body, right? As you move, as I'm, gesturing, and I am thinking, right? So you think and you feel and you process and you are in the world with your body. So you are your body. And there's an incredible amount of wisdom and knowledge and processing that happens below your conscious awareness that lives in your body, right? So it's not a separation. You are embedded in it in all the ways. So for me, that's like the opening, that's the opening bid. That's so important to understand. And I think, I forget who said it, but someone talked about how body signals can get misinterpreted. And I think that's a very crucial point. And interpreting our body skills correctly is a skill that we teach at Precision Nutrition and that we can learn. So if you're listening to this thinking, I'm completely disconnected from my body, first, that is an after effect of trauma or difficult things or stuff happening to you, but you can relearn it. So don't lose hope. It's a very teachable skill. But a good example of that is the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that runs, it's a cervical nerve that runs here, and it also innervates your internal organs. But a lot of the traffic on the vagus nerve is upstairs to the brain. So we really do literally get gut feelings. And a lot of us interpret that as hunger, right? So we might be feeling something else. Maybe our heart rate is increasing, for example, or we're getting like clenching in our stomach. And we think, oh my gosh, I'm hungry. I have to alleviate this, right? And that's not wrong, because eating is a terrific stress reliever. Like it is A++ self-medication. And clients are shocked when I say that. They're like, oh, no, but eating is so bad. And I have all these bad foods and I eat emotionally. I'm like, yes, we could come up with some better tools. But first, let's honor the fact that you have come up with a brilliant way of calming yourself, soothing yourself, regulating yourself. In that moment of binge eating or whatever it is you're doing, you feel terrific. And even babies are often given sucrose to calm them, right? So there's something like in us that uses food to calm and regulate and soothe. And we can use food to dial it up and dial it down, right? So food is a way to change our stimulation level, and chewing stimulates good feelings. So that's so important to honor. And to not say like, oh, I'm broken and bad and screwed up. It's like, no, honor that. And then I'll even go one step further and say, listen, if you're going to have an emotional eating episode to calm yourself down or whatever it is you need to do, slow it down. Like if you want that chocolate, like go and commune with the chocolate, like be with it, be present with it. Don't like plow it all in, because that's a very, dingy sort of thing, right? The speed. Right. Slow it down, have the pleasure. Yeah. Immerse yourself in it. And people are shocked when I say that. They're like, oh, I'm allowed. And I'm like, yeah, you are. That's the catch. Slow it down. That's the game. So that's one. I mean, there's lots of approaches, but that's one, is simply slowing it down. And you want that ice cream, like be with the ice cream and really get that pleasure out of the ice cream. And you'll find that you eat less and also feel more fulfilled, actually. So it's a bit counterintuitive that I think what people are expecting, but that's how we roll, and it works way better.
No, I absolutely love that. I don't have to like rage eat cheese standing in the kitchen. Like
no, rage eat sitting down.
I'm gonna be with my
rage eat bite
right now.
Jen, what about you? What are some ways, when you work with your clients and all that, you can honor it but sort of redirect it?
Well, I think the big thing is to remind yourself to give yourself a break. Like, you're not seeking perfection here. We're not trying to like solve this solution right at the like present moment. Um, and like Kristen said, there is no separation of mind and body. So you know, the whatever is stimulating you from the outside or whatever you're thinking is affecting you on a like subconscious level scientifically that you aren't aware of. And certain things, you can start with just getting present to understand and feel those sensations, whether it be the shortness of the breath or the heartbeat. And that's again going towards the more like amped up side of it, or whether it's the like more lethargic, I can't move, I don't have much feeling, numbness side of it. Being aware of it first, being present about it, and then just the observation of it is important enough to where you don't feel the pressure and the need to have to change it right then and there. Because, you know, I think the ultimate goal, at least in the world of yoga, is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Like, we're humans, we're always going to have something, like human existence is suffering, right? That's a big, you know, philosophy. So to think that you're to reach some perfect level at some point where like none of this affects you ever, I think can kind of throw people off their game and make them stop before they even started.
Okay. Good. So I'm going to take a question that was submitted and put a little spin on it. So the question was triggers you depend on to bring joy back into your day. But I want to hear from our panelists on what they do to bring joy back in their day. Carlos, we know you like your wine at 5 o'clock. That brings you your joy. I'm kidding. But what are some things that you guys do, and maybe you're not even knowing that you do it, but things that are triggers for you that you bring joy into your day with? Jen, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so I love to be active. Being active, now that I have all the time to be active and I'm not teaching as much, you know, I make time for some, like a practice, a yoga practice, whether it's a full practice, getting in the meditation of pranayama as well as the asana, and then doing something a little bit more active. Like, I live in a beautiful neighborhood, and I've taken more time to walk around and explore the Garden District and really notice houses that I've like probably passed by 15 years in a row and never noticed them before. Definitely love that. And as I said before, New Orleans is such a community-driven place, and now we're having all these social distancing, but we do have some pretty amazing porches. So my neighbors and I like all meet outside, you know, around 5, and we put our little chairs up and we all talk to each other from the porches. And, you know, still being able to connect with a human being after being in your house all day is just definitely joyful for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Carlos, what about you?
I think I'm also similar with the physical movement. I think, like, for me, because I wasn't working out as much at the beginning of quarantine, I started to see literally the mental and like not physical in the sense of like how my body looked or whatever, but I just felt off. And, you know, on top of everything else that was happening, that kind of made it much worse. But for me, I'm a big music person. Like, music is literally, I have like 4 different headphones with chargers just in case. Like, I don't leave my house without at least 2 headphones because I'm not going to get stuck without music. And I literally have playlists for different moods. Like, if I want to get amped up, I have 5 or 6 playlists for that. I have my professor grading papers list. I have my the world is getting on my nerves playlist. Like, for me, because I know that like music resonates with me at a very like primal physical level. Like, my mood can literally shift based on like what music is playing. So I lean into that because I know that it's a good way for me to go to a positive headspace if I'm not already in a positive headspace. And also, like, if I'm in a too excited a headspace, like, I know that music can kind of bring me down and calm me down. So for me, that's what I kind of use as a positive trigger whenever possible.
Krista, what about you?
Yeah, listening to Carlos talk, and Jen too, like, what strikes me about the joy triggers is that all of them that I can think of are very right brain kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So they're not like thinky brain kinds of like, I have to think myself into this. It's like things that speak to our right brain, which is like that kind of almost childlike, playful, you know, oriented to sounds and colors and stuff, part of our brain. So like whatever you've got. So I wrote, music was one that I wrote down. I get fixated on songs too. And I won't even tell you the song that's I'm playing lately, but it's almost like if you could imagine yourself like chewing bubble gum and like on roller skates and there's like sparkles on your, you know, your TikTok filter, like that's the song. And so that's like my, yay, I'm gonna have a great day one. But also stuff like I live near a dog park. I don't have a dog. I love dogs, but I don't have one right now. And just going and like watching the dogs play and they're like, yay, the ball, like they're just having the best time. And if someone lets you pet a dog, it's amazing. So for me, it's like silly pictures. I love comedy, like good comedy. Listening to stand-up comedy, for me, that's like, all I need is like one funny line and I'm good. And I'll tell you one more thing, images are powerful. This morning, my partner and I kind of snarked at each other and, you know, we both were like kind of poopy face and he left for work and I was like, right. And I sat down and I opened up my messenger and for some reason my messenger popped up, like it went all the way back to early conversations we'd had and it popped up a picture that he'd sent me and the picture was like him doing something and he was looking funny and cute and I was like, oh, that guy, like it immediately changed my mood towards it, right? Yeah. So anything that will stimulate your right brain into good feels is like a win.
Awesome. What about you, Patty?
I'm going to confirm what Krista just said about the right brain because the things that I lean on would be journaling and music as well. Music is probably, I would say music is probably the number one thing. I'm also super active as well. So I like to go out for walks because I just find, you know, touching on what Jen had said, before quarantine, I would never go out for walks in my neighborhood. And so now that I'm going out for walks, it's like, oh, that's my neighbor. And like, now I see them out and about and, you know, it's nice to actually like recognize people and be able to wave to them, even though I don't necessarily know them on a personal level. So walking and definitely the music is just like, that's the one thing. If I'm in a really, really not a positive headspace, just pop on that one song and it just takes me back and like totally pulls me out of wherever it is I am. And Krista, I'm going to guess that your song is probably like a Taylor Swift song.
It is the Osmonds' One Bad Apple. It's like 70s. It's like 70s suburban disco. I heard it randomly the other day. I was like, I can't stop hearing this in my head. It's like an earworm.
Well,
I love it.
Coming up on time. But I did want to address, we got one more question in that I think we should address. And Krista, I'm gonna have you start with this one. And the question is it really healthy to program ourselves with these triggers that result in a desired behavior? Isn't this using a hack? And is that bad?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I think there's lots of assumptions embedded in it, right? I think there's an assumption that, you know, there's some kind of natural state of being that we would all gravitate to if we weren't hacking our lives.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you know, I think about hacks as like I think about wearing glasses, which is that I could spend my whole life like doing this, or I could just put on a pair of glasses and get on with my life and, you know, have a much better life experience. But I think like without realizing it, we are always getting hacked, right? Our environment is so strongly predictive of our behavior. So whether we choose to hack ourselves or whether we are getting hacked, you know, things are happening all of the time. We are embedded, we are complex systems and we are embedded in complex systems. So something is influencing our behaviors and our feelings and our thoughts all the time. So it's really, what hack are you gonna choose? Am I gonna choose this hack that's inside me that I feel helpless and hopeless in the face of? Or am I going to choose my hack that I feel like gives me some level of empowerment and subjectivity and agency? Yeah. And I don't want to imply that I feel like we have to construct this like whole castle of our lives. It's like, I can only have these 500 hacks and be happy, right? It's not like that. The goal is always simplicity, fun, joy, pleasure, doing, you know, making do with less. If you're over hacking your life, you're doing it wrong. But the question for me is really, who do I want to put in charge of my hacks? And as much as possible, that's me.
Good, I like it. So before we sign off, I will tell the participants we are going to send out a recording of this and everyone's email address. So if you have additional questions, you can reach out. But before we say goodbye, I want to throw it out to the panelists with any final thoughts, anything you want to leave anybody with before we say ta-ta for the day. So Jen, why don't we start with you?
There we go. I just want to say thanks for having me. I've enjoyed this a lot. I've enjoyed listening to you guys. It's been informative. And I just hope that, everybody realizes that we're collectively moving through this as best we can, and, do your best to educate yourself, and, to speak to the hacks thing, like, it's not just about yourself, but it's about how you interact with other people. So if there's a way that you can, use your hacks, your methods to make yourself feel better and joyful, to spread that around, then I'm so behind it.
Love it. Thank you. Patty?
I would love to say thank you as well. And I just wanted to say that if you guys are feeling, overly reactive, take a moment to really stop and identify what it is that you're feeling. Like, if you don't know how to identify feelings or emotions, Google it. It's super simple I had to do that first. I'm like, is this normal? Really just pay attention to the things that are setting you off, so you can either find a tool to help you manage it or find another route. But if you don't acknowledge it, it's just going to keep happening.
Yeah.
And if it keeps happening, it can be really, really disruptive. So and for me, what I found personally is once you identify it, that's the hardest part, because then you can start to kind of figure out how to work around or how to tackle it. That's my advice.
Thank you. Carlos?
I guess to piggyback off that, my big thing is like, be kind to yourself. You're not gonna figure your entire life out, in quarantine. Like, I remember when we first started quarantining, we were all supposed to write our first novel, get another degree, start a new career, all in like 3 weeks, right? And my big thing is like, there's a lot of things that we're all dealing with right now. Like, the world is literally upside down, right? And there's no right way to deal with this. Yes, there are certain things that we obviously shouldn't do as coping mechanisms if they're dangerous to us or the people around us. But there's no template for where we're at right now and the types of triggers that we're dealing with, right? If we're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, like, our generation, the generation right before us, the generations after us, like, they have no idea what all of this is, right? We've never been in a pandemic. We've never had to stop, right? We've never had to come to a full stop. And how we're processing that, how we're adjusting to that, the amount of social media engagement that we're doing now, which can be unhealthy as well and create its own set of triggers. All that to say, when we're having these moments, be kind to yourself. Enjoy the hell out of that ice cream, right? Take your time, like, leaning into those things. And I love that Krista said that, because it also ties into, am I really hungry, right? If I'm slowing down and I'm just taking my time and enjoying the process of eating and using that as a coping mechanism, I guarantee you that that's going to be a different engagement with that ice cream or that cookie or that cake than if you're just, right, I just want to get it done because you think you're hungry or you think that this is going to help. So again, like, being kind to yourself, and if you want to have some ice cream, if you want to have some cake, if you want to have a glass of wine, do it. Like, it's okay. Like, you're going to be okay. But feeling like we have to figure all these things out in the moment, like, that's just adding way more pressure to an already tense situation, and just adding another self-imposed trigger now, because now you're creating a trigger about being productive or like getting a certain number of things done in a certain time frame. Now you're creating a whole nother trigger on top of all the other triggers that are already triggering the triggers of the trigger.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carlos. And Krista?
Yes, triggers all the way down. Yeah, I love that Carlos said this, because I think we often feel like the path is to criticize ourselves and to change, right? But that has the opposite effect, because now you're just adding threat on threat on threat on threat, because criticism inside your own brain is still a threat. You become the abuser in your own brain, right? And there's enough assholes in the world. We don't need to add more in our inside our own heads, right? And the analogy that was taught to me by a judo teacher is, try to like get really angry and frustrated and then try to run. You can't. It's like you run like a penguin, right? And then like get loose and floppy and be like, okay, I'm cool. And then try to run. And of course it's beautiful and flowing. And so the compassion, the gentleness, the kindness, the love for ourselves is what enables us to flow. So if we want to get out of this with our sanity intact, compassion has to be the path. And I guess the advice that I would give is to say that you are more resilient and resourceful than you realize, especially if you look for what is already working, what is already good, those little tiny moments of joy and happiness and watching the dog play with the ball or whatever. Start to become a curator of that, you know, and an accountant of that. Start to add those up and look for them. Because once you start looking for them, the more you'll find them. Your mind will attend to them. But trust that you are more resilient and resourceful than you know, and be so kind to yourself. Be so compassionate to yourself, because, you know, like I said, we don't need more assholes.
Well, thank you all so very much for your time and for talking through all of this. I know I personally learned a lot. Really, really appreciate it. To all the attendees out there, thank you also. And we'll send out the recording and everyone's contact information soon. Thanks all. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, guys.